Hello and welcome to GeograPod, a podcast about geography with your host, Will Mehle. Today, I'm going to bring you guys a really interesting conversation I've had with a friend of mine, Joel Sabot. He's currently going to school in Quebec, the province of Canada, and that's a place that speaks a lot of French, has a really long history of French influence and French culture. And overall, we're going to be talking about French colonialism in the Americas and how that's affected the cultures and the societies and the governments of countries that exist today. And we went to a lot of really interesting and different places, and it's a bit of a longer one, but I hope that you guys stick with it and listen through the end. Thank you. Thank you for talking to me. Could you please introduce yourself and say where you're from?
Hi, I'm Joel Sabot. I'm from Thornton, Colorado, and I'm currently studying at McGill University in Montreal.
And McGill, that's a pretty prestigious school, is it not?
Yes, and although I'm studying physics, I have very passion in geography. So
that's cool. Well, thanks for being here. Today we're going to be talking about French colonialism in the Americas, and that French sort of presence, that French influence is something that can really be felt in Quebec, no?
Yes, I guess we can start with Quebec. Quebec is very heavily influenced by French culture. I'm going to start first with the first settlement in Quebec, which is Quebec City. In 1608, there was a expedition sponsored by the King of France, and they discovered Quebec, and they founded a city, Quebec City, right there in 1608. Or they didn't discover Quebec, they went back to settle it. Samuel de Champlain was the main man of that expedition, and he found a really nice spot on a cliff on the river. Geographically speaking, Quebec City is actually a very interesting spot in terms of physical geography. You've got the Montmorency Falls, which are nearby, and then you've got these big cliffs. And while the initial colonization was very rough, lots of death and lots of disease, dealing with Indians nearby, it got really messy. They actually had to abandon and come back to it.
So it wasn't quite a permanent settlement.
Yeah, it was very, very, I guess, flowy. But once they actually could establish a settlement, there was a lot of things that had to be thought of now, right? New laws or anything that relies to France governance there. So the big thing was the seigneurial system. So this was sort of developed at that time after probably around the 1650s or so, when the population started becoming more permanent. Then you started having more influence of the French monarchy. So essentially, the idea is very similar to feudalism in that the king owns the land, and then you are given, a ownership, a share of the land, sort of like a lord, right? But in France, they were known as the seigneur, which is hence the name, the seigneurial system. The seigneur would own a piece of land and would be in charge of tending to the land, figuring out who works the fields and such. And this is the main driving force, I think, of the geographical implications of how Quebec looks right now. So here I have a picture to describe it. There's a lot of these very narrow plots of land, and they can be seen all over North America, actually, particularly along lots of rivers. You can see it in Louisiana, but you can see it a whole lot more clearly in Quebec. So they usually are a ratio of 1 to 10, but there's some extremes that have gone to 1 to 100 for these land plots.
We're talking really skinny areas of land.
Yes, precisely. And these lands, it was sort of a very interesting communal aspect to them too. Because these lands are actually, like in the US, the idea is, we have a grid, you put your house in the middle, and you walk quite a ways to talk to your neighbor or whatever. But in France, the idea was that you want to always, France is very social during especially during the cultures, like during meal times and such. So because these plots were so close together, the people could actually like walk a couple feet to the plot next to them and be like, oh, let's have dinner or whatever, right?
That's pretty well set up. It's sort of interesting how they organized the land in Quebec City, with them being so far away from the King of France and from France's mainland. It'd be sort of easy to just do your own thing. To what extent did they follow the rules of France or the laws set out by the French king?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting thing and that I was going to bring up a little later, but basically they did follow it very well, and they did have, it was very feudal, right? So you had peasants and you had the ruling class, and there were, you can actually tell by a lot of the names of these places, you can tell that they are very particular about the ruling class. You have like a lot of street names in Montreal are named after famous governors or people of religious significance as well. That was another huge cultural piece as well, is the idea of spreading the religion, right? Which to some extent was very highly tied with the king as well. So religion also played a huge significance in them remaining loyal to the king, right? And that's the big part.
With the divine right to rule and such.
Precisely, yes. And then so you have the British as well, who are in the area. And the British are sort of, to the south, and they're, the U.S., right, is sort of coming about. But the big thing is the 7 Years' War. And that was a big part in, identity, right, as well, because, I'm French, so I'm going to fight for the French. Yeah. And they were actually called the Canadians at that point.
Oh.
So the French people who lived there, mostly the peasants, were called the Canadians. The French people they'd actually boat people from France, soldiers and such, which is very interesting. So the 7 Years' War was a huge point, basically, where you've got the British and French pinned against each other. The French were actually allying themselves with a lot of the native populations because they did not actually have that many people. Geographically speaking, Quebec was very hard to reach for the French, and also economically. It was very difficult to sponsor missions there, so they actually relied a lot on the local population. And the big thing that really set apart, that's what really France lost the war, essentially, because of their lack of resources and their lack of keeping Quebec together, really.
And the 7 Years' War, that didn't just involve Britain and France, right?
Precisely, yeah.
As you mentioned, there was a lot of native groups involved, but am I incorrect in thinking, I remember the Spanish were involved in it somehow. There was a lot of other European powers sort of mixed up in it.
Right. And so the Spanish were slightly involved. I can't remember specifically where, but the big thing was the Indians, and they were a huge point of contention because the U.S. or the French had signed a lot of treaties and then the British had also signed a lot of treaties, and so it was a really weird mess with the natives of the area. And when you go to Quebec City, the big thing is that they talk about is the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, 1759, was a huge battle. There were, I think, 11,000 British troops and around 9,000 French troops, or troops fighting for the French, but 4,000 of which were natives. So there was a very interesting interplay between the natives and the French as well. And the French got along with a lot of the natives, but they also didn't get along with other natives. So it's a very delicate interplay that happened in there.
Yeah, it was a very complicated situation. I've heard descriptions of the War of 1812 and the 7 Years' War as being a war in which nobody really won, but the Indians surely lost.
Yeah.
Where whichever side they were on, they lost some of their land and they lost some of their sovereignty.
Yeah.
I wanted to backtrack a little bit when you said that French people in Quebec were identified as Canadians at the time. To what extent was that sort of an additional identity or a separate identity from France?
Right. So Quebec was sort of didn't have exact perfect contact with France. So, in that sense, the identity of being Canadian sort of arose because they started having families, and the problem with France was that they didn't really like do much immigration to Quebec. Most of the population arose from people starting families. And so you have this really interesting identity where the French people came and then a lot of them had families in Quebec. Although the women did not come very much, which is why the famous trip of women or whatever that they sponsored 200 women to go to Quebec to start families with the men, because the population was very men, like I can't remember the exact number, like 70% men or something like that,
geez.
Which is pretty high. But again, back to the Canadian part. So being Canadian became like an identity now that people were born in the new world, rather than a bunch of people immigrating.
That's pretty interesting, because I see a lot of parallels between that and sort of the Spanish system, where you had peninsulares, people who were born in Spain, sent over to the New World to sort of rule over the people. Then there were Creoles, who were like Spanish, but they were born in the New World. And then there was mestizos, who were a mix between Indians and Creoles or peninsulares. And then there was Indians, who were part of the system. So Spain sort of tried to regiment that, but it was sort of unsustainable. But you didn't really see that happen in France. Like, there was never a revolution by the Canadians, was there?
No, there was not. And actually, this brings me to my next part that I wanted to talk about here, which is the Quebec Act. So after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham that I talked about earlier, the French had lost too much and had to capitulate Quebec. They had to give it up to the British, and that was the Treaty of Paris in 1764, which essentially gave New France over, which New France included mostly Quebec, to the British, although they still retained Louisiana and that part of the U.S. So France had sort of lost in that sense. But in 1774, the British were starting to see the U.S., of course, getting sort of riled up, we could say. Yeah. And they basically passed what's called the Quebec Act, which allowed the seigneurial system to remain in Quebec. It allowed the French to continue keeping their identity and as well as their religion. This is pretty rare for the British to do, and it of course upset a lot of British colonies. So the Americans actually came up to attack Quebec.
Really?
Yeah. It's called the Battle of Trois-Rivières, which is the town, which means three rivers. It was a very interesting piece of the the American colonists and British colonists, because you've got this huge mix now in Quebec. You've got the French, and now you've got the British, because the British they did a big thing where they settled in Quebec, and there's this thing called the Eastern Townships in Quebec now, where they're mostly actually started by British people. But the Quebec Act was a very, very instrumental part in Quebec society now, I think, because in the end, they got to keep their identity and they got to keep their seigneurial system.
Do you think it would have been possible that if the British hadn't allowed them that they would have just been assimilated into the rest of Canada and there wouldn't be this unique Quebecois identity?
Yeah, I think that is a very compelling point too, is that without the Quebec Act, I think essentially they would be assimilated, because the British were pretty brutal as well when they wanted to assimilate people into the colonies. But being Quebecois has become like a big part of that area, and there's been secessionist movements as well that I've been calling since really when big political events happened, especially when Canada split from the United Kingdom. Then it became a very a much different issue where they're like, okay, well now we're Canadian, but we sort of want to split from Canada now.
Yeah. their future was sort of up in the air, and they were trying to decide what they should do.
Yeah.
To what extent do the people of Quebec sort of want to secede now from Canada?
Well, it seems like a mixed bag. There are a lot of people that I talked to. There are some people who are like, Quebec is just, well, specifically like Canadians, not from Quebec, who are like, oh, the Quebecois are just a bunch of loonies. And then you've got the people in Quebec who are immensely proud of their French heritage, and they want to remain separate from Canada. And Quebec is the second largest province of Canada with about 8 million people. I'm not sure the exact percentage, but there's a good amount of people who probably near 30 or 40%, I would assume, who really would push for like a Quebec libre or free Quebec.
Okay. Though Quebec's secession would be a little bit of an interesting topic, just because the geography would split Canada in half, basically, because you have, correct me if I'm getting the names wrong, but you have Newfoundland and Labrador and a few other of like Canadian provinces.
Yeah, Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia are out there, so it would definitely split the province.
And then
provinces.
What would they do there? Would there have to be like sort of an EU system where there's free trade and free movement through Quebec to get from those provinces back to like Ontario and Alberta?
Yeah, so that would be a very tricky issue to deal with, because Quebec is essentially the thoroughfare of the goods into Canada. Montreal used to be the largest city of Canada, and it used to be the center of trade of Canada. The Montreal Stock Exchange was where everyone was going and stuff. But then the rich people in Montreal were, because of this really weird split between the French society and the British society, you had the British people were owning all the factories, and the French people were still, because of the seigneurial system, were still seen as like peasants, right? And so you had a lot of poor people living in Montreal, and a lot of rich people living in Montreal who did not want to live in Montreal anymore. So they moved to a little place that no one knows about called York, which eventually became Toronto.
Oh.
And so then they started moving everything to Toronto, and then all the trade was happening in Toronto, and the manufacturing was happening in Montreal. You had a big port in Montreal. There's this big clock tower that's really famous that's sitting on the quays there, that would be like the port of entry to Canada. And so they'd have like a guard standing there that would like mark when the ship comes in, right when it crosses the clock tower. And so it's very interesting to see this new wave during the Industrial Revolution of all these ships coming in to port, because Montreal was the port of entry. That was the easiest way, because the St. Lawrence River is a really big river. It allows for all these big boats to come through. And of course, Quebec means the mouth of the river, like the narrowing of the river. It's actually from an Algonquin word, which meant the narrowing of the river.
That's pretty interesting. I always just assumed Quebec was a very French phase. I didn't quite know where it came from.
Yeah, so Quebec is initially came from the Algonquin, and the name is Quebec, but spelled with a K, so it's Kebec, like Quebec. Okay. And the French Frenchified it.
So when you talked about maybe 70% of the colonists coming over here were male, to what extent was there, do modern Quebecois have Indian or Native American ancestry?
Yeah, so there's this very interesting identity now called the MidT, and they are the people who are the mix between the French and the local native population. There is still only like 2 to 3% of the population that is like 100%. They were been down generations of native ancestry, but to some extent, I don't know the exact percentage, but there are a lot of native people there, and Canada has been, of course, promoting all of these new programs now to basically reconcile the very tough British colonial rule over them. And to some extent, Canada had those issues too. Even in Quebec too, when the British came and then Canada became its own country, you started having these re-education programs, essentially, where they would send natives to these schools to become civilized.
Yeah, and for the sake of the recording, Joel just made quotation marks when he said civilized, just to make that clear. The to my knowledge, wasn't there also like the stealing of Native American children, sort of like you saw with the indigenous in Australia, who were then taken by French or British people and raised?
So there was that. One of the things with the French, though, was that they, like most of the nearby nations, they were constantly working on, establishing a relationship with them, to the point where they would be very good, in very good standing with the natives, and then they'd go and then they would bring the missionaries to convert them, and then they would come and become Catholic after that. And that was a big shift too, because you've got then now these people coming from the natives and who are mingling very much with the French, and so you have this very interesting interplay between the Catholics who want to convert them, and then you've got the natives who actually, they wanted to be with French people. They wanted to, they've learned, this person, I'm gonna marry this person or whatever.
Yeah.
So it became a very interesting interplay.
Yeah, and I imagine there was some beneficial trade on both sides. Like that's what drove a lot of the relationships, just the ability to provide services that the other side didn't really have at that point.
And then, of course, you also have the bringing of disease, which was a big issue for the natives, because that wiped out a lot of their population as well.
Yeah, it was. They had pretty much no immunity to certain diseases that the Europeans brought over, and it, I think that probably dealt the most damage out of anything. So, moving on to another sort of aspect of Quebec. So the region of Quebec was originally founded by French colonists. To what extent is the French language still spoken there?
Yeah, so being in Montreal, it's a very bilingual city. People right now currently, French is spoken at home by most people, and English is also spoken at home by most people. So, of course, you sort of got the British influence in there. But prior to that, because the French, came in and colonized, they have sort of, and then they have the British then took it over, but still let them have their identity. They're still able to develop the language and teach it to the younger generations, which creates a very interesting part, because it was severed from France. So they had their own French that they had, really, because it sort of became isolated from France for a long time, or I guess until now it's become a little bit more. Quebec and France are very, very good trade partners now, but in general now you've got a lot of people speaking French, and you've got a lot of programs that are trying to preserve the French. It's so much so that even in France, the stop signs say stop. They like the English word stop. In French, it's stop. It's the same thing. But in Quebec, they are they want to preserve the language as much as possible. So the stop signs actually say arrête, which is the French word for stop as well.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting preservation aspect now in Quebec, where a lot of people want to speak French. A lot of people can speak both English and French. And so when you speak French, you will find the Quebecois will really like when you speak French, because it's a sense of pride for them. It's their identity, of course, and a very interesting piece. Once you leave Montreal, you get almost no English speakers. Everyone speaks French beyond that.
Yeah, so it's sort of indulging in their culture to sort of speak French. doesn't the people of Quebec speak a different dialect of French?
Yeah.
How did that develop?
So I have looked a little bit into the linguistics, but essentially, because it was so isolated from France, because France was very strained on resources, essentially the language has sort of been passed down in like a single state. And it is theorized that perhaps that the Quebecois French is very similar to Old French that was spoken when the colonists first came over. And because there was not much immigration, you didn't get a lot of spread from the French government in France. You didn't get many French people. You had people who were born, and the dialect maybe sort of morphed a little bit and became a little bit of its own thing, maybe a little different than Old French, but you can still see the effects today. Throughout the streets, you can see like old words used to describe things. You can talk to people and they will say really strange, like for example, in English we would say like a beverage, right? And the French at the time, actually another big part of the colonial French was that they had a lot of alcohol. That was one of the biggest imports actually, and they would have the breuvage, which is literally brewing the beer and stuff. And so that sort of morphed into now how we call beverages today, but in Quebec they call them breuvage. And rather in France we would say boisson because that's just drink.
Huh. So we had basically the same language when French colonists left from the mainland and went to Quebec, but then they took two separate routes. So like French from France took one route, and then French in Quebec took another route. So are they more different than like British English and American English? Like, are the differences between the two dialects like really substantial, or are they sort of just cosmetic?
Well, there are so like I was just explaining there with the breuvage thing and the boisson, that's a big part. But like a lot of like outdated words are used more in Quebec. Like there are words that definitely a French person would know but would not use in this era, perhaps. Like a car is called un char or voiture in French, but char in Quebec. And char is a very classic in French would mean a chariot or like a wagon that would be pulled by horses. So you have these like really interesting old words that have been thrown in. So it's almost like speaking to a person who has sort of like a modern take on English, but throws in some Shakespearean stuff in there, which is quite interesting. And then furthermore, you also have the English influence, which is a huge part of the Quebec dialect now, because the English becomes like almost like it's sort of hard to not speak English because in the end you had to swear loyalty to the Queen and or the King, and so basically the English was almost unavoidable. So English did slip into the language, and you get some really interesting words where like shopping in French we would just say shopping, but in Quebec they would say magasiner. They made up their word because magasin is shop, right? So they're like, well, we want to be turn the English word into like a sort of Frenchify the English word. So a lot of English words have been incorporated in that, like as well. Watermelon, melon d'eau, is what they call it in Quebec, which literally means watermelon. But in France, we would say pastèque, which is a different word. So in a sense, it's a very to describe it like in English, it's like talking to a person who can speak Shakespeare but has these really weird mixing with another language.
It's like, what would Shakespeare call a computer?
Yeah,
It'd be a little bit different. That's Quebecois. So in this episode, we're talking about French colonialism exclusively in the Americas. So we're going to sort of ignore, at least for today, French Indochina, a lot of the French colonies in Africa, like Algeria, places like that. But I would like to move south and talk about a few of the other French colonies in the Americas. There was, of course, Louisiana, and then there was Saint-Domingue, which we know as Haiti today, and then French Guiana. Let's start with French Guiana. It's still part of the nation of France today,
Yes.
right?
So French Guiana is what's called a département, which is essentially similar to a state in the U.S., where it's like it's its own administrative region. It has sort of its own like policies and stuff. But the big thing with French Guiana is the space industry. So France launches, the European Space Agency launches a lot of their satellites down there, mainly because of being close to the equator. It's an ideal area to launch rockets. So when France had that colony, it sort of now has become this really interesting thing that has the space industry, but also has the local people there who mix with the Creole. Like you got a very interesting Creole down there. Which is a very interesting foothold of French too, because they stayed a lot in North America, but they went slightly south and they could only grab a little bit of South America.
Yeah. The one thing I always found, two things actually, but one thing I always found interesting about French Guiana is since it's part of France, it makes it so that France's longest border with another country is actually with Brazil.
Yep.
How crazy is that?
That's a pretty interesting factoid, and which is even more interesting too is it's a European nation, right?
Yeah.
And it's a full-on département of France, which means that if you're born there, you're a European citizen. You're in the Eurozone.
Which means you could retire anywhere in the Eurozone, basically,
Yeah.
in Europe.
Yeah, and you have a similar status with Martinique, which is the other island that France still holds in the Caribbean. And then you also have, there's still actually a foothold in Canada. There's a little tiny island called Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, which is a super tiny island off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. And there you've got like I think it's 5,000, 6,000 people who live there. And that's also part of France.
That's pretty interesting. The second thing I wanted to get to with French Guiana, you talked a lot about launching satellites from French Guiana. Is that part of the French Space Agency, or do they still have a space agency?
No, so France's space agency was, and a lot of the European space agencies were, when the European Union came about, were sort of fused into one giant space agency called the European Space Agency. And so you do have like local companies in France, like Airbus and stuff that work on like smaller type things, but the big rockets, the things that NASA type projects like sending a rover or sending a satellite that studies very interesting aspects of the Earth or whatever. A lot of those are the European Space Agency. They're really the big ticket items.
Yeah, large scale items.
The NASA of Europe, basically.
The NASA of Europe. To what extent would like Germany help build a satellite that's then launched in French Guiana? Yeah,
so Germany might manufacture like a piece. They might be like, oh, we need Germany for these manufacturing capabilities. We need France for these to design some stuff. We need Spain to help us, or just recently there was universities in Italy who were teaming up to come up with an experiment to launch. So you have a very interesting interplay between the nations there, and launching rockets in French Guiana.
Okay. One last thing I wanted to mention about French Guiana before we moved on is that if it was its own country, the people there would actually have the highest GDP per capita of anywhere in South America. It's sort of an interesting place, and the capital is Cayenne.
Cayenne, yep.
Cayenne. Moving up to the Caribbean, I think you mentioned Martinique, but there's also Guadeloupe and a few other small islands.
St. Martin and
Yeah, and those are all owned by France still, yes?
Yes, and they're also small départements. There are very few people who live there, not too much, but the people there are still also part of the Eurozone in those footholds, I guess.
Are they considered départements also?
Yeah, they're both.
Okay, so to what extent would they have the same amount of power as like a U.S. state within France?
So, well, they do get, I believe, to vote for president. But again, the population is so tiny in these areas that it doesn't have like a huge influence over politics. You do have local politics in the areas, and you did mainly the reason that the French have these places is because the movements to leave France haven't quite panned out exactly. They had referenda, but the referenda didn't quite gain as much momentum, or you had a lot of French loyalists, or whatever sort of held them behind has sort of kept them part of France. And now France has granted these very special administrative regions. And the same thing, even if you go to Réunion, which is by Madagascar, you got these really small islands, very few people, and they don't have much of a say in things because they're just so few people.
Makes sense. Sort of French Polynesia would be.
And yeah, French Polynesia as well. Yeah.
So there's not like a French version of the Electoral College. These guys aren't overrepresented within the French.
No, because the French political system is essentially works by representation. So you have to get above a certain threshold to be elected. So you have to have 25% of the vote or 20% of the vote for you to get past the first round, and then after that, you get eliminated based on whoever has the most votes. It's just a pure numbers thing.
That's an interesting way to do it. Back in the most recent election, wasn't it that Macron, who ended up becoming president, didn't he only have 22%?
Yeah. So the first round has, of course, you've got all the candidates for the president, and there's 15 or so candidates, and you've got two candidates it was Marine Le Pen and of course Macron. They were both made it past the 20% threshold to make it past the first round. After you make it past that, there's only two left, and you either vote for Macron or Le Pen, and boom.
All right, that sounds pretty good. So moving up to Haiti, that was originally the most wealthy colony in the world, was it not?
Yes, correct. And with the plantations, it was the booming industry. A lot of sugar cane and tobacco were being exported from there and sold all over America. It was very interesting to see this thing. And then the big hot button issue with Haiti was slavery. In Quebec, I didn't talk about it much, but Quebec did not have as many slaves because most of the people actually couldn't afford buying slaves and bringing them over, so not that many slaves were in Quebec. But Haiti, on the other hand, they needed a lot of labor to help with the fields, and so you of course got a lot more of the slavery come into play, which then of course brought Toussaint Louverture, and then you've got the whole revolution that happened with Napoleon, and now you have Haiti.
It was really pretty interesting because Saint-Domingue, which is basically, that's what they called that half of Hispaniola, the French.
Yep.
And then the Spanish owned the other half, and they also called it Saint-Domingue, except in Spanish it was Santo Domingo. So I just found that sort of interesting how the two sides of the same island were different colonies, but they were called the same thing.
Yeah, so you also have that in Saint Martin, because you have Saint Martin, the French one, and Saint Martin, the Dutch. So you have half of the island is called Saint Martin, there's it's split in half, and each side is called Saint Martin. But you've got the French Saint Martin, and you've got the Dutch spelling of Saint Martin.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So yeah, that's pretty interesting how they were given the same names. Sort of how slavery ended up working out in Haiti was they imported so many slaves that there was actually 35-1, I think the ratio was.
It was a big ratio, which is one of the big reasons why now there was that big revolution too, was that they had the numbers and they had people, and you had a very controversial phase too after where then they started pledging loyalty to France, and then France was wow, this is sort of weird, and then it was a weird back and forth thing.
Yeah, wasn't the Haitian Revolution sort of inspired by the French Revolution?
Yeah, and it was a very interesting subject too. which like the French Revolution in itself was sort of a turning point as well, because that's when like most that colonialism was ramped up. You have Napoleon, who of course wanted to have an empire, and he came to colonize all these areas, although lost Quebec, but
though in a lot of cases recolonized, right?
And recolonized, yeah.
After the 7 Years' War, Quebec was lost to the English, and the Louisiana territory was lost to the Spanish. So Napoleon had to conquer Spain to get Louisiana back.
Right.
And he had to conquer the independent nation of Haiti to get Haiti back. But that, I mean, obviously, like you'll notice today, Haiti isn't part of France. It didn't really work out. Napoleon didn't do the best job, like sort of reconquering these colonies.
Yeah, but you can still see a lot of the ripples of the French. You can see Haiti still has French taught in all the schools, and French is a language that's spoken there. In Quebec, of course, as we talked earlier about French being very prevalent there, obviously. And then in Louisiana, you have a very interesting Creole with the English from the U.S., and then some French words just spritzed in there. And of course, you know, the towns that like Baton Rouge or Baton Rouge is a French word. So a lot of American cities can actually credit some French founders and trading posts. For example, St. Louis, Detroit, all these areas along the rivers have...
Detroit was French.
Yes, Detroit.
Oh, that is pretty cool. I had no idea. But then you also have like Des Moines.
Yeah, and Des Moines, and you got all these areas in French in the U.S., which, quite frankly, you know, you're like, wait, that was French? And so, and of course, the French are very Catholic, right? So St. Louis is a very, you know, a name that has religious denominations to it, and you can see that all over in Quebec. The Catholic had a huge... the missionaries had a huge foothold all over Quebec, and so in Quebec, it's very Catholic. You've got very strong. Just recently, there was a bill that passed. They call it the secularism bill, that banned religious symbols. And in the Quebec Parliament, they have a giant cross in it. That's like so it became sort of a weird situation in Quebec with this religious significance as well.
Is that still in the process of passing, or is it already?
It's already been passed, and if you wear a religious symbol to work, you can be fired, essentially.
Oh, geez. What sort of spurred this on? That doesn't seem like a law that would be written sort of out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, they elected sort of a more conservative government, and they wanted to pass this secularism idea, and people thought Quebec would not pass it, but it did pass, and it got a lot of support in Quebec. So Quebec is a bit strange politically in Canada too, in that, you know, they have their own identity, and they're not quite autonomous. They're semi-autonomous, actually, and there's they call it a premier of Quebec. So you have a very interesting interplay with that as well.
That's pretty interesting, because I think you see in Scotland, which is another country that sort of has its own culture but is part of like an English majority nation that sort of has their own secession movements. I think Scotland has a premier also. Yeah. I think they elect that going on.
So it's a British idea to sort of do these areas that are sort of, because Quebec was sort of a I don't know, like a fire waiting to happen. You know, it had the kindling and everything, and just a slight spark and boom, you're gonna have another revolution on your hands. So a lot, and when Canada split from the British, then the Canadians mostly on the western part of Canada were worried about losing Quebec, right?
Yes. So sort of you allow a little bit of autonomy to keep stability in the region.
Precisely, yes.
So one last thing about Creole. Was Creole sort of like a general term as far as I'm aware? Like Creole in New Orleans is not going to be the same as the Creole in French Guiana.
Right, yeah. it essentially indicates a mixing of the languages of the local languages there. Now, the Creole in Louisiana is not the same as the Creole in like Guadeloupe or whatever areas, because in Louisiana, it's the U.S. is very English speaking, so you got the English with French splashed in. But in like Guadeloupe, or in Saint Martin or Martinique or Guyana, French Guiana all have different local languages that sort of been interspersed with the French, which creates a sort of vibrant communities in these areas where they speak French, but they also have retained some of their traditions, and so they have, very like Caribbean style traditions.
It's pretty interesting, pretty unique. Well, thank you for talking to me, Joel.
All right, have a good day.
Yeah, you too. I would like to thank Joel Sabot for talking with me, and I would like to thank everybody who listened through the whole thing. I know it wasn't the shortest podcast, but there really wasn't too much I wanted to cut out there. It was we talked about a lot of interesting things, I think. But thank you everybody for listening. Please check back in for future GeograPods if you enjoyed this one, and I hope I'll be able to put another one out soon. Thank you. Have a good day.